Hello, in this video I would like to share my thoughts about the F90x camera in a kind of impressions review. This camera is known in North America as the N90s. I want to focus on the practical performance of this camera in general handling and everyday use compared to more recent SLR designs. This video will not go into the details of the function or technical specifications unless they are necessary to make my point. The general technical properties and functions of this camera can be found in the descriptions. On some occasions I would like to make comparisons with the more recent digital SLR D700 to put the properties of the F90x in perspective with an example of a more recent Nikon DSLR layout. But this is of course not meant as a comparison video of any kind in between these two cameras. The camera construction of the F90x consists of a metal frame covered by a plastic outer shell. The construction feels very solid in general. There is no flex or movement to the body parts noticeable at all. Since there is hardly any metal on the outside, the camera never feels very cold and can be operated in very cold weather without gloves. All really important parts of this camera are well constructed and made from stainless steel. This includes the lens mount, the hot shoe, the neck strap eyelets, the tripod screw mount, the battery compartment screw and the inner screw thread on the inside. This is the rewind fork, the backdoor hinges and the parts of the backdoor locking mechanisms on both sides. The weight and shape and size is just right for an enthusiast style camera. It feels good and secure in the hand. The rubber parts on the grip of the F90x cameras are made from another material than the one on the D700s. This older material is less grippy and less spongy. It feels harder and stiffer with somewhat less grip. These grip materials, however, don't peel off over time, like most grips on the D700s. The rubber material used in the F90x is virtually identically to the rubber material used in the F4 cameras. So it really feels good. It's not as grippy and as spongy as the modern rubber material, but it stays in place even after many years, and for an old camera that's important, of course. On the back of the camera there has been applied a rubberish material. This material degraded on most units by now and got sticky. It was removed on this unit and replaced by a piece of leather. For removing the rubber material on the back, about an hour of work has to be calculated. The back door of this camera is easily detachable. This makes this task a lot easier, of course. The back door is generally robust and trustworthy like the rest of the camera. The buttons on the shoulder of this camera are mostly in alignment with the surface. The controls, which protrude a little bit beyond the surface, still have a very round, flat and low profile shape. The same is true with the hot shoe, which is completely sunken into the prison roof. This approach of flat surfaces adds to the robustness of this camera, because obviously survivability means not only withstanding force but also not offering an attack surface in the first place. In general, the plastic outer shell does not seem very confidence inspiring at the very first look, but in general operating the F90x soon leaves the impressions of an overall dependable and very robust constructed camera. The F90x was produced between 1994 and 2001. The units are, as of today, 2019, between 25 and 18 years old. So all the electronic components and the seals work flawlessly, and they will do so for many years to come. The control philosophy of this camera looks a bit unusual at first sight, but it is very close to the modern DSLRs like the D700. The on-off switch on this camera is a sliding design instead of the rotating design around the shutter release of a modern Nikon DSLR. This works fine too, and I think it's a little less prone to accidentally activate, but this is of course a matter of taste. The shutter release has a very precise travel, not too long, not too short. It's very similar to the one in the D700. The command dial is big and easy to access. The haptic feedback of the D10s, however, is less refined than in the D700 dials, but it's still usable and nothing to worry about. The camera has two displays, one on the top of the camera and one in the viewfinder. The display on the top of the camera is small in comparison to a more modern SLR design. It is still contrasty and very good readable. It has a built-in backside illumination, which actually works a little bit better than in the D700. It shows most information that you would expect from a modern DSLR, but because it's smaller, it doesn't show everything. For example, if you dial in exposure compensation, the display will tell you by flashing this symbol, but it wouldn't show you how much exposure compensation is dialed in. In order to see, you have to press down the exposure compensation button. The display of the D700 would show you immediately how much is dialed in. The display in the viewfinder is illuminated by an electric light source in the prism roof, and as well through a translucent piece of plastic in the prism roof by the ambient light. That means that no matter how bright the subject in the viewfinder may be, the display will always be good readable, because the surrounding ambient light will also light up the display from behind. The viewfinder of this camera is nice and bright and for sure good enough for every kind of photography. The viewfinder covers 92% of the frame. For film photography this is just right, since there may be a cut-off in print processing. The focus screen is exchangeable. The standard focus screen, which you can see here, is called Type B. This screen is optimized for AF operation. It can be used for manual focus too, of course, but it doesn't have a split screen. It shows a big circle indicating the area of center weighted metering, a smaller circle showing the area of spot metering, and two brackets which indicate the borders of the wide AF metering field. The center AF metering field is not shown. It is smaller than the smallest circle. There is only one other screen available for this camera, which is called Type E, and this just adds rule of thirds style grid lines to the already existing design. There is no focusing screen available optimized for manual focusing with a split screen, for example, but a manual focusing is assisted by the autofocus system, so it isn't really necessary actually. The F90x has a built-in eyepiece shutter. This is usable while taking exposures with some kind of autometer mode engaged, while the eye of the photographer is not on the viewfinder. For example, metering with the camera on a tripod while you stand next to it, or taking pictures from the hip or over the head of a crowd, or taking pictures with a self-timer. In this case, light entering through the viewfinder could distort the metering of the camera through the lens. The F90x has one cross-type AF point, which is quite a good one. If you are the focus and recompose type, you will be happy. The autofocus with AF lenses is quite loud and sounds a little bit like a coffee grinder. The autofocus works with all AF and G lenses. The focus speed on the F90x and on the D700 is more or less indistinguishable from each other. Even in dim light with low contrast targets, it is hard to reproduce a situation where the D700 would find a focus point and the F90x not. The F90x has actually 3 AF points. There are 2 AF areas to the left and right of the center point, but they are not cross-type and not very good. So it is possible to deactivate them, and I usually do this. There is no button for backside focus on the F90x like on the D700. There is a AF lock button in the front of the camera, but that's not as convenient as the back button operation on modern DSLRs. While manually focusing on the F90x, you can use a focus indicator in the viewfinder which will tell you if you are in focus. The shutter speed can be adjusted in 1/3 stop increments with the F90x. The shutter offers a shortest exposure time of 1/8000th of a second and a longest of 30 seconds. Of course, there's bulb too. The flash sync speed is 1/250th of a second. During the auto modes like aperture priority mode and program mode, the display will show an exposure time, but the camera will expose at the mathematical correct time for the light situation, not necessarily at one of the displayed exposure times, but times in between two. I could not find a credible source of information according to the shutter life of the F90x. Some sources suggested 50,000, other 100,000 cycles as the tested shutter life. If we assume the more conservative lower number of 50,000 cycles, that doesn't sound like much at first, but let's make a quick calculation. 50,000 cycles resemble approximately 1,400 rolls of film with 36 exposures. I bought this camera 3 years ago, almost unused, and exposed about 40 rolls of film by now. These are 1,440 shutter actuations in total and 30.3 rolls per year. To reach a number of 50,000 cycles at this rate, it would take me approximately another 100 years. If I would shoot on average 1 roll of film per week, which I don't do, it would take me still almost 30 years to reach that number. So 50,000 cycles doesn't sound like much, but for an analog enthusiast camera like this really is enough. And anyway, reading online about this camera leaves the impression that this camera can actually do more than 50,000 cycles. Mirror slap is a topic of importance for me because I tend to do a lot of close-up work with ambient light or light bulbs instead of flashes. SLR cameras without mirror lockup tend to show a certain degree of vibration blur between 1/30th of a second and 1 full second exposure times due to the mirror slap. This is most prominent when using long lenses. I wanted to use my F90x for my close-up photography, but I was concerned about the effect of mirror slap. Because the F90x doesn't have a mirror lockup, and I usually expose at times which are exactly in this critical area. To determine the effect of mirror slap in this camera, I made a series of pictures with a 135mm macro setup. The focus distance was at around 1 meter, like I would usually use. The aperture stayed at f5.6 and the lens and the target weren't touched throughout the whole test. I used 20-second delay time release and made sure there are absolute no vibrations until the exposure was made. I took every shot 2 times. The light difference between the shots was made by an artificial light source which was moved away from the target accordingly to create the same exposure on every shot. The shutter speeds ranged from 1/60th of a second to 1/4 of a second in full stop increments. I used Agfa APX 100 film. In this test I exposed it for ISO 80. I developed it in Rodinal in a 1+100 dilution over 10 minutes with moderate agitation. The results can be seen here. The visible crop of these pictures covers a surface of approximately 3 by 3 millimeters on the 35 millimeter negative. This is the first with 1/60th of a second. Again 1/60th of a second. 1/30th of a second. Again 1/30th of a second. 1/15th of a second. Again 1/15th of a second. 1/8th of a second. Again 1/8th of a second. 1/4 of a second. Again 1/4 of a second. Half a second. And another with half a second. I looked very carefully at these enlargements, but I couldn't really identify any blur or some sort of difference between the exposures other than the usual variations you can expect from analog material in general. So what do you think? Leave a comment. It seems to me that under the circumstances I take pictures and with the material I use, the mirror slip effect is not reproducible. This is really impressive because the D700, which has a mirror lockup, produces quite visible mirror slip blur in these critical exposure times if the mirror lockup is not engaged. Maybe if other film material and other setups are used, with this camera it would be visible, but for me that's not an issue. The F90x camera offers matrix metering, center weighted metering and spot metering. The matrix metering was always spot on in any kind of situation I used it. The pictures came out right exposed, roll after roll. The matrix metering system has less fields than more modern systems, but nevertheless this system seems to work flawlessly. Center weighted and spot metering can be used too, of course. The F90x meters with all AI and AIS lenses in center weighted and spot metering mode, but not in matrix metering mode. The F90x meters with all lenses or optical devices attached via an adapter in center weighted and spot metering mode, no matter if this would be a microscope or a telescope or something completely different. The exposure meter lock on the back side is a slider, but a button like on the D700 would be preferable in my opinion, but it still works fine. The depth of field preview works like on all mechanical Nikon cameras. A button on the front has to be pushed against the spring. This does not work like the more modern electronic depth of field preview of the D700. The depth of field preview of the F90x will stop down the lens on the value selected on the aperture ring. If you operate the camera in program or shutter priority mode with an AF lens, you will have fixed the lens at its smallest aperture position. That means the depth of field preview in program or shutter priority mode will not show the depth of field that will be created for the exposure, but always the one for the smallest aperture. In contrast, the electronic depth of field button on the D700 would be preferable because this would show the correct depth of field in program shutter priority mode, even if the AF lens is locked in its smallest aperture. But with manual control and aperture priority mode, the depth of field preview on the F90x works as expected and will be mostly used in these modes anyway. You can mount and operate almost every AI, AIS, AF, AFD, AFS and AFI and G lens on this camera. The G lenses, however, are not fully supported. Since the G lenses don't have an aperture control ring, you cannot set the aperture. That means they can be operated in program mode and in shutter priority mode, but aperture priority and full manual mode won't work on G lenses. VR lenses can be used, but the stabilization won't operate. That means you can take pictures, but they won't be stabilized. There is a way to get some kind of aperture priority mode with G lenses with a workaround. This trick doesn't work with the F90 and the N90 cameras, unfortunately. It only works with the F90x and the N90s. I'm showing in this demonstration the X Nikkor lens because this is the only G lens I own. This lens would of course produce vignetting if I actually used it for taking pictures. When it comes to G lenses, the motive programs, which are usually not very much noticed, become interesting. These motive program modes are selected by pressing the PS button and spinning the control wheel. The motive modes on this camera are PO for portrait mode, RE for red eye reduction, HF for high depth of field mode, LA for landscape mode, SL for silhouette mode, SP for sports mode, and CU for close-up mode. Of interest are only 3 of these modes: the portrait mode, the high depth of field mode, and the close-up mode. These 3 modes offer you the possibility to dial in an aperture, and the camera won't change it, no matter of the light situation. These 3 modes I mentioned make virtually the same thing. The only difference is that they start from a somewhat different aperture. Portrait mode and close-up mode will start from a somewhat large aperture, while HF mode will start from a small aperture. When the camera goes to sleep or you turn the camera off and on again, the camera will start from the value, from the base value. It doesn't remember the value you have dialed in before. The other modes I mentioned will not offer this possibility of aperture priority mode because they will change the aperture you have dialed in depending on the light situation. While using a TTL flash, this workaround doesn't work completely. The depth of field mode will let you take pictures only in slow sync mode, but will let you choose your aperture. The other 2 modes will prevent you from choosing small apertures. The portrait mode will not go smaller than f4, and the close-up mode will not go smaller than f8 if a flash is attached. If not, you can choose the aperture however you want. In order to open the back of the camera, it is necessary to move 2 sliders. This is almost impossible to do by accident. When I put a film in, I open the back door, put the canister on the left side, and I pull the film all the way until on the other side. And to make sure it sits properly, I gently turn this shaft to make sure that its hooks engage in the sprockets. And I notice that they have engaged. I can close the back door. Then I turn the camera on and press the release button. The camera advances to the first frame and is ready to shoot. I never had any problems this way. For rewinding the film, there are 2 buttons necessary to avoid unintended rewind, but I won't do that now. The F90x uses 4 type AA batteries. These batteries can be bought almost anywhere and everywhere. Depending on the temperature, operation style and type of AA cells, up to 150 rolls of 36 exposure films are possible with one set of batteries. I put these batteries in 3 years ago and never recharged them, made 40 rolls of film, and the indicator still tells me that they are full. The F90x has 2 ports. One is for connecting a flash system. The other port is a port over which the camera can be remote controlled. Furthermore, this port can be used to read out information about the last rolls of film you have exposed, and the camera settings can be reprogrammed. But unfortunately, there is special equipment necessary, and this is hard to come by these days. Additionally, the F90x has a TTL flash hot shoe. All kinds of flashes, TTL flashes, can be attached, but the new TTL flashes, they don't work with this camera. They don't meter correctly. So at the end, in general, what do I like about this camera? I like that it takes 4 AA batteries and they last more or less forever, and I can get them whenever, wherever I want. It has a very nice size and shape and weight, just right. It is very well constructed. Also, the outer shell is made from plastic. It's really a nice camera. It's very durable and very dependable, you can tell. It offers a very good matrix metering system, which is very reliable. I didn't get a single bad exposure whenever I used matrix metering. It is very affordable on the used market. It's probably the best deal in the Nikon SLR world right now. It can be remote controlled. It has very good TTL flash metering, and it has in general a no-nonsense design. It's a very straightforward, easy operation style. No extra stuff you don't need. It just gets out of your way while you make pictures. It's just the right stuff on it. Things I don't like that much is that of course it doesn't support fully the G lenses. There is no way of full manual control of G lenses, and for aperture priority mode there's just some kind of workaround, but no complete solution. The exposure meter lock on the back side is a slider. I would like a button, but well, slider, at least there's something. And I would prefer back focus button on the back, like the D700 has. This one has the AF lock. I can use that, but the button on the back would be more handy. But nevertheless, I like this camera very much. Just in case you're wondering why I have these stickers on my camera. Once I wanted to take pictures of my little niece at Christmas time, and she thought that this camera looks boring, and so she made it beautiful with some stickers on it, and that's a nice memory, and how could I remove them? They will stay.